And that is, of course, the report that a crucial E-3 Sentry aircraft was, as the Wall Street Journal described it, damaged in a Saudi airbase attack. They say an American E-3.
So these are our flying radars, basically. Planes that extremely important, especially now that we've lost all those long-range radars in the Gulf. These planes can serve somewhat as a replacement to a limited degree. They're not nowhere as good as those ground radars, but they're a makeshift replacement.
Sentry was among the aircraft damaged at the Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia on Friday.
That's the air base Saudi Arabia gave us permission to use 3-4 days ago, because the rest of our bases in the Gulf are so damaged they're pretty much inoperable.
Base was hit by an Iranian missile and drone attack, which injured 12 service members and also damaged several U.S. refueling planes. They noted that the E-3 Sentry is an airborne warning and control system aircraft that helps manage the battle space and track drones, missiles, and aircraft from hundreds of miles away. Now, if you've seen the images of this attack on social media, you will automatically know that this plane is not quote-unquote damaged. It is basically destroyed. And we're going to get into here in a minute the fact that there's not much the U.S. is going to be able to do to repair it, at least as things stand right now. But
see those pictures?
That, just the fact that
that's totaled, absolutely totaled.
The Wall Street Journal is trying to kind of lessen the blow here, right? To act as though, oh, it's not that big of a deal. No, this is a major deal because it continues to eat into the U.S. and its ability to see how things are happening in the Gulf region, to see where missiles are coming from, when they're coming in, and to then at least attempt to respond accordingly.
Since we've lost all our long-range radars in the Gulf, especially.
Reports noting that the E-3 Sentry jet will cost around $1 billion to replace, and that Iran's attacks possibly destroyed 3 Stratotankers, costing around $80 million.
Stratotankers, those are the refueling aircrafts that are used to extend the range of fighter jets, so they can reach places deep in Iran, for example. Because the distances, for example, from Israel to some places in Iran is too far for a fighter jet to make on its own fuel tank, and so it needs these things to extend their range.
Each. You also have analysts noting on X that the U.S. Air Force has just 16 E-3 Sentry aircraft left, and that nearly 40% are already in the Gulf theater, and there's no production line to replace them. As a result, Kelly Greco of these...
That is something you'll notice for nearly the entire military. Yes, U.S. has the strongest military, but it's more like a legacy military. It's like all these military assets were produced decades ago, and we're just using them, maintaining them. We don't have the ability to replace them fast if they're destroyed.
Stimson Center described this as one of the most strategically consequential losses of the war so far, noting that the E-3 is a flying command center that manages the entire air battle, tracking drones, cruise missiles, and aircraft across a 250-mile radius and directing intercepts in real time. The Wall Street Journal then followed their initial report up, admitting that the quote-unquote damaged U.S. jet's nearest replacement will cost more than $700 million. The closest alternative, they say, is Boeing's E-7 Wedgetail, which was projected to cost more than $700 million apiece last year when the Pentagon tried to cancel the program, only to revive it under congressional pressure. The Air Force this month said that Boeing could build as many as 7 Wedgetails with enough funding for the multi-billion-dollar program, which is years behind schedule. And that has got to be one of the most fascinating parts of this.
There's so much waste at the Pentagon. That's why the price tags of all these things are so astronomical. It's all a bloat. We've downsized our actual manufacturing ability and upsized our military bloat, basically. It's terrible.
War. The fact that the U.S. waged an entire war against Iran, not preparing for what happens if Iran fights back. What happens if Iran follows through on its threats to target every U.S. military base in the region? What happens if Iran is able to make around 13 US military bases in the region uninhabitable. What happens if Iran
That happened.
is smart enough to target the eyes, to target US radar systems and US spy jets, to go after everything the US is using to intercept future attacks from Iran? They're not just wearing down US air defenses and wearing down their already low stockpile of interceptor missiles. No, they are specifically going after their radar systems and their refueling tankers. And it's a reminder that Iran did not just sit back and
The loss of every one of those refueling tankers makes it harder for us to strike at Iran. It makes less tankers available to refuel jets that are making trips over to Iran. And the loss of those nearer bases, the closer bases to Iran, these, you see all the little planes, so damaged they're not usable. That's why one of these two is where that attack she was just covering happened. And so they've hit the near ones. Now they're hitting the far ones because that's where we're operating from. And yet to see, it becomes even from here, for a fighter to go all the way into Iran and hit somewhere and come back, they need a refueling tanker for that. It increases the logistical burden for striking Iran. And so we can carry out less strikes. Iran is doing a good job of wearing down our military capacities.
allow these attacks to happen. Now, they've been preparing for direct war with the US for decades. But on top of that, they've also spent the last several months preparing for a regional war because they were reminded in the aftermath of the 12-day war that the US was not going to be an honest broker in negotiations.
You have Iraqi militia that is gathering on the border of Kuwait and Syria, preparing for if we escalate things with a ground invasion. So everything could still get a lot more messy in the Middle East.
That the US would go into talks claiming to want to make some sort of a nuclear deal, and then it would turn around in the middle of those talks and it would attack, which is exactly what they did in June of last year. Fast forward to January of this year, and the US and Israel are openly taking credit for fueling the protest inside Iran, the violent riots, the terror attacks that are ongoing inside of Iran.
It was an attempt at a color revolution in Iran.
The US and Israel are...
Yeah, you had the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury admitting and bragging about having shorted the Iranian rial, their currency, and causing it to crash, causing these protests. So these weren't just the result of domestic mismanagement on part of the Iranians. Those protests earlier this year were the result of an economic attack by the United States.
Over here saying, yeah, you've got Mossad telling the people on the ground, we're with you. You've got the U.S. Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, bragging to the world that the U.S. intentionally manipulated Iran's currency in
there it is.
order to spark these protests to begin with. And now you have the Telegraph claiming that, Russia was directly involved in the latest attacks, that it was Russia that took satellite images of a U.S. airbase in Saudi Arabia 3 times in the days before an Iranian attack on the site wounded American troops, according to Ukrainian intelligence.
Yeah, that's just guesswork on part of Zelensky. It's probably true, but he has no way of knowing that.
It's being noted in an interview in Qatar, where Zelensky said that a report showed that Russian satellite had taken images of the Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia on March 20th, 23rd, and 25th. Now, we don't have confirmation from Russia on these claims, but can we just, for just a minute, talk about the level of hypocrisy here? Because do we think, seriously, do you think that the Ukrainian military, that the Kiev regime, that they do literally anything without approval from the US? Maybe.
They are completely our puppet and proxy. Everything they do because we tell them to, and we give the intelligence, and our generals tell them how to wage the war.
The UK will throw them in there.
The only thing the Ukrainians do is the dying.
But specifically from the US, because it's no secret that the CIA literally rebuilt Ukraine's intelligence sector. It's no secret that the Ukrainian military relies on not just military aid from the US, but intelligence from the US. It's definitely no secret that when you have Ukraine firing off long-range missiles targeting Russia, yeah, there may be a few Ukrainians in the room, but it is a US attack on Russia.
Exactly. And Iran is payback for that.
So the idea that Kiev is over here pointing the finger and saying, oh, well, Russia used satellite images.
Big winner to both these proxy fights, Ukraine and Iran, is China, because U.S. is getting its military capabilities are being degraded in the Middle East, and through Ukraine, Russia is suffering damage. So, whereas China is just slowly building up its military to go after Taiwan.
That they then shared with Iran that Iran then used for this attack. And it's like, oh, really? Do we want to talk about Starlink and the role that they are playing in the war in Ukraine? Do we want to talk about the fact that the US is literally directly involved? And that a large part of that involvement is from intelligence sharing with Kiev. So if Russia did or did not share satellite images, it's like, okay, well, what's the big deal here? This is something that has become a common practice in the West. It is something that has allowed the Kiev regime to survive as we know it to this day. But I'm not surprised that the mainstream media is making a big deal out of this and acting as though, oh, we have to point the finger at Russia. And it's like, okay, good for Russia if they did, because they know that the US is an existential threat to all of the key pillars of the multipolar world. For the US, all of these wars are wars of choice as they desperately try to maintain their hegemony around the world. For Russia, for Iran, these are existential wars.
Absolutely. Yeah, Trump didn't understand that coming in. You'd really know when he went to meet with Putin to negotiate that, yeah, Russia's objectives in Ukraine, you can't compromise on any of them. They regard them as part of their national security, their survival. So Trump wanted a ceasefire, but there's no way Russia could have agreed to that.
They have to fight, right? These are existential threats on their border or literally in their country that they are fighting back against. So, of course, they are going to do everything possible to continue that fight. And speaking of the ongoing...
Okay, let's move on to...
One of the latest news about a new fighter jets being shot by Iranian air defense system, which was F-18. And here is the footage of that.
Yeah.
It clipped the tail.
It seems Andre later on in an ocean somewhere he just crashed. This fighter was crashed in the ocean. I don't know what happened, but what was happening?
Something was damaged when it hit. It could still fly for a bit, but then it went down.
Andre, this hit was done, as we've learned from the Iranian media, by one of these air defense systems that they keep on their shoulders.
Yeah, it's man pads. Yeah, most likely it's older versions of Strela, but I believe, and again, you have to understand, they do not really go often for the kinetic kill. They have the warhead. It's an infra. The guidance itself is homing devices, infrared, and you have the essentially the bag of the all kinds of the shrapnel, and that's basically, it guides itself towards the most heated part of the aircraft, which of course is the nozzles, exhaust of the engines. So, and that's where you see those shrapnels. So it might look from
that's exactly where it hits, the back of the jet, the hottest part.
Away as if nothing happened, but reality is that it basically creates a lot of holes, let's put it this way, in the fuselage, and it can damage, obviously, critical systems. So F-18...
so you see, it's just like the same principle of a grenade. When that missile, that anti-air missile exploded right near the rear of the jet, a bunch of shrapnel, put a bunch of holes in the engine. And it could still fly for a bit, but eventually that damage brought it down.
in is not the type of aircraft which can take, this punishment and still continue to operate. And of course, A-10 Warthog, for example, it's slow, but it's very survivable. It can take a lot of punishment, let me tell you. So the same goes, for example, for Russian Su-25, which is called frog food in NATO. But obviously, with the newer missiles, I think it was the older missile, the newer missiles, especially like Igla and obviously Verba. Verba is the newest one. It can take down pretty much anything. Okay, so I don't know what is going on in terms of the manpads, but I am absolutely positive that Iran has very many of them, enough to sustain. For years, maybe, so, and we don't know what Russia and China provide, but today Mr. Pezeshkian, the president, expressed the gratitude to Russia for standing behind Iran. So, and this is like, oh, okay. So who knows? But yeah, it's anybody who thinks that United States can operate close air support in Iran or near Iran, well, manpads are there, and they will be taking down pretty much most of the aircraft which will try to do this. And so that's what we see, and this is not the first, that's not going to be the last.
So that's the second aircraft Iran's taken down. The first one was an F-35.
And especially if they decide that somehow they want to do the boots on the ground, although after today's article in New York Times, I already posted it on my blog, that the U.S. Army fights now remotely, works remotely.
Yes.
Never heard anything like this. Okay?
What does that mean, Andre?
I don't know.
Yes, I saw that. I think that's hilarious. It means they're staying at hotels and working remotely instead of on the bases.
It's beyond.
It's also using human shields, basically, by doing that.
It defies, as Karl Marx stated, history repeats itself first as tragedy, and then as farce. We are beyond farce. We are in the state of, I don't know what it is. It's a complete, basically, panopticon, and working remotely, redeploying cavalry battalion from the cellar or the basement of the UAE Hilton to the Kuwait Sheraton. It's I don't know. I mean, there are some things.
Most likely hotels, yes, that where they're doing it.
Which defy.
And those become valid targets if Iran finds out where.
I mean, any kind of the common sense, let alone military common sense, and let alone the professional military view on the war. And but that's actually the indication of how badly United States and Israel losing it, and they're losing it catastrophically, actually.
Andre, in the last 2 or 3 days, we had Donald Trump various times talking about how is the situation, but instead of playing that clips of Donald Trump mentioning how grateful he's winning, I have some sort of special video that shows how Donald Trump is drastically winning everything. Here is the video.
Yeah, it's gonna be incoming warning. Lying president incoming.
We're gonna win so much you may even get tired of winning, and you'll say, please, it's too much winning. We can't take it anymore. Mr. President, it's too much. And I'll say, no, it isn't. We have to keep winning.
Yeah, he's literally saying the same thing right now when it comes to the war.
Yeah, I mean, he is, I don't know what state of the mental state he is in. It's definitely not healthy, And when you look especially at his Minister of War, Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, the guy is really, he needs to get, serious treatment with all kinds of the serious pills, to probably get him in shape, because they sense, some do know that it is catastrophe for the United States. And
I went over it yesterday. Yes, Iran is winning this war. Iran has won this war. There's nothing we can do to prevent it. All it has to do is hold the Strait of Hormuz closed 6 months. And we don't have the troops to stop it because we didn't prepare any before starting this war. It'd take at least 6 months to get 100,000 troops or more ready to go in and seize the Strait of Hormuz. And so we just don't have the time. We're locked into this thing, and Iran's going to hold the Strait of Hormuz closed. global economy is going to get wrecked. Democrats will win the midterms, and Trump will be impeached. Iran has a route to cause regime change in the United States.
Some people say Suez moment. Well, Suez moment is a kind of, doesn't even convey the scale of.
This is a Suez moment. Suez was the moment where the British Empire collapsed. It was the moment where, everyone regarded that's when it collapsed. Yes, this is going to have the same impact on U.S. military. It's for on one side, it's actually going to degrade our abilities because we're wasting all this ammunition, offensively and defensively, and it takes years to replace it. So we're going to be critically low on practically everything for years to come, and that makes our deterrence about something like Taiwan practically non-existent. Well, I won't say that far, but severely degrades the deterrence there. And then there's going to be the fact that we're going to lose to Iran, like this lesser power, because it didn't have to happen. Like if United States and Iran fought on an even playing field, like if our president didn't get us into this war in the worst possible way, and by the worst possible way, I mean with no popular support. That means we can't handle any amount of casualties. It completely ties our hands that way. Not having any troops ready to go in and secure the Strait of Hormuz. Like, if he bombs a leader with 200,000 troops ready to go in and secure the Straits of Hormuz, then we could have maybe secured the Straits and saved the global economy before it crashed. But we didn't have that. Let's see, and him being impeached because of this, that's also self-inflicted. He could have very easily gone to Congress and got authorization, done what is necessary, arm twisting, and then at least he wouldn't be able to be impeached over this mess. He would have been safe from that, but he didn't do it. Oh my God. Okay, let's go on.
The historic, catastrophe, and which didn't start. Iran basically is reading their last rites for the, globalism as it existed before. And we can say already the most terrifying thing for Washington did happen is the end of the petrodollar. Period. It's over. Not like, it's over, it's coming. We knew it was coming, but this is like, that's it. Here it is.
Yep. The end of the petrodollar. Speaking of that,
the 15th of March 2026 marked a historic day as oil aboard the Pakistani-owned tanker Karachi passed safely through the Strait of Hormuz, denominated not in US dollars but in Chinese yuan. That same day, another vessel also went through, carrying crude on a yuan-aligned route, but it challenges an agreement which has underpinned the very foundation of America's economy, the petrodollar. In return for American protection, the Gulf states, these 6 countries here, would prop up American interest and sell their oil in dollars. But a deal that was supposed to secure American dominance instead handed a small group of countries extraordinary leverage over the most powerful country on Earth. Since the
yes, in a way, but really they are puppet states, so we prop them up. They are not democratic at all, and without our support, they don't rule.
US and Israel wiped out Iran's supreme leader. A wave of attacks have spread across the region. The Gulf states didn't sign up for this.
Then again, they might get a different patron saint, like China might turn to China for weapons and for the military power to prop up their undemocratic regimes.
50 years, their deal with America has held. But right now, for the first time, the very countries propping up the American economy are watching the terms of that bargain fall apart. So what happens when they decide to stop playing ball? Maybe not an immediate collapse, but a slow bleed, and one that could bring America's era of global dominance down with it. So, how did a handful of desert states end up with this much leverage over the most powerful country on Earth? To answer that, you have to understand what they've built, and how quickly it can fall apart. In the last century, the Gulf states have gone through an enormous transformation, largely thanks to one thing: oil. Oil was first discovered in Bahrain in 1932, and within decades, the entire region was producing it. And by the 1990s, that oil money had completely transformed what these places looked like. Areas which had once been nomadic desert towns suddenly became sprawling metropolises. Dubai alone went from a modest trading port to a city of glass towers in barely a generation. But this wasn't just an economic boom, it reshaped how these countries were governed. Oil wealth was entirely state-controlled, which meant that everything, wages, subsidies, infrastructure, flowed from a centralised system financed by oil. And in exchange for political obedience, the government distributed enough of that wealth to keep people compliant. It's a social contract, just not a democratic one. And as long as it holds, it works. But the deal only holds if two things are true. The money keeps flowing, and the region stays stable. Which is why in recent
And both of those things are gone bye-bye now.
decades, the Gulf states have made an enormous effort to diversify and rebrand. Saudi Arabia has poured hundreds of billions into tourism and entertainment. The UAE has marketed itself as a global hub for finance and innovation, and Qatar hosted the World Cup. These countries were no longer content to simply be oil exporters. They wanted
That was so stupid, hosting the World Cup in Qatar. When the temperatures there were insane, and they promised to have air-conditioned stadiums, but they didn't deliver that. So some of them, they had to move the World Cup from the summer to the winter because of that, so that the temperatures would be okay for playing. And the World Cup should be a summer event. I was so annoyed.
to be players on the world stage. Today, tourism alone accounts for roughly 12% of Saudi's GDP, and around 12%
How much tourism do you think they're getting these days, eh?
of the UAE's. Dubai's international airport is the busiest in the world for international passengers, and the region's sovereign wealth funds manage trillions of dollars in global, more importantly, American assets. But all of this, the skyscrapers,
All in US dollars.
the airlines, the funds, is underpinned by one thing: the perception that this is a safe, predictable place to park your money and do business. And in just a matter of weeks, 30 years of building that perception came undone.
Bravo, Trump.
After the US and Israel launched strikes on Iran, the country quickly retaliated. Civilian areas and military bases alike across the 6 nations of the Gulf were hit by missile strikes. The biggest oil refinery in the world was shut down. The biggest gas refinery in the world was shut down. And this is already costing the region around 6.7 million barrels per day. And at current prices, it's roughly $1 billion every single day. And remember, these countries aren't democracies. There's no election to absorb public anger. The social contract in every one of these countries depends on the government being able to keep the money flowing and their streets safe. And when that breaks down, the regime itself is at risk. But here's the thing, these
Exactly.
aren't powerless countries. They spent 50 years quietly building themselves into the load-bearing wall of the global economy. And if they decide America is threatening their survival, they have the tools to make Washington feel it. Combined, they control nearly a third of global oil output every year, with by far the largest share coming from Saudi Arabia. Even more importantly, they also control well over half of the world's oil reserves. Essentially, the price of oil is extremely dependent on whatever these countries decide to do or not to do. If they were to, say, threaten to cut production entirely for a sustained period of time, unless the US stops the invasion, they could send global energy prices soaring, which should be more than enough to pressure the United States into pulling back.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting idea. If OPEC tried to pressure Trump by having its members that are still producing oil cut production to pressure the United States, yeah, that would be a pretty strong leverage, because right now, with how tight the markets are, they can't afford to have a lot of other big producers be taken out.
Share what countries decide to do or not to do. If they were to, say, threaten to cut production entirely for a sustained period of time, unless the US stops the invasion, they could send global energy prices soaring, which should be more than enough to pressure the United States into pulling back, or at the very least, discourage it from turning this into a long, drawn-out occupation. And time again, we have seen one of the main success metrics Trump uses is the markets. And Trump in particular ran a campaign promising to bring energy prices down. So having the opposite happen just
Yeah, he did run on that, and he's done the opposite now.
before the midterm elections would be a political nightmare. If all of that sounds a bit extreme, it's worth remembering that a version of this has happened before. In 1973, In response to Western support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War, oil-producing Middle Eastern countries, led by Saudi Arabia, abruptly shut off the flow of oil to the US, drying up the steady stream of Middle Eastern crude that Western economies had come to depend on, and sending oil prices from $3 to $10 per barrel in just a couple of months. This kicked off nearly a decade of high inflation across the West, peaking at over 13% in the US. And before long, Washington began to soften its position, pushing for ceasefire negotiations, and eventually getting Israel to bring the war to an end. But while that leverage might have worked for the Gulf states a few decades ago, the truth is that the world looks very different today. For starters, the US is way less reliant on Gulf oil than it once was. Before the oil crisis, roughly a third of US oil came from the Gulf. Today, that number is closer to 10%. In addition to this, the US now produces more oil than any other country on Earth, and has actually become a net exporter to a number of countries. But what?
Because of fracking.
Whilst on the surface, this may seem like the Gulf's influence has been diminishing. In reality, since 1973, their power has only grown. In the last couple of weeks, America has unleashed its military strength. But the truth is that the superpower's biggest strength doesn't come from its weapons, but the dollar. As you may have heard before, the dollar is what's known as a reserve currency. Currencies used to be backed by physical commodities like gold or silver.
Not physical commodities, just gold, not other commodities. Used to be backed by gold, period.
But today, they're essentially backed up by dollars, which make up around...
Oh yes, in Middle Ages, silver was used too, yes.
Around 60% of the world's foreign exchange reserves. If countries want to show that their currency has value, they need to hold dollars. Of course,
and yes, there was silver dollar in the United States. Yeah,
that raises the question. If other countries use dollars to back up their own currency, then what's backing up the dollar? You'd expect it to be America's technology, its economy, or even its military strength. But in reality, it almost entirely comes down to a quiet agreement with the Gulf states from nearly 50 years back, one which created what's now known as the petrodollar. This is a pattern which comes in many forms, but pops up in the playbook of nearly every great power across history, and has the power to make or break them. At the start of the 19th century, Britain was the world's undisputed superpower, controlling a quarter of the entire world's land and roughly 20% of the global economy. Because of that, global trade essentially revolved around the empire. Cotton from India, tea from China, rubber from Malaysia, all came into British ports. Now, when you're at the centre of a system like that, something interesting happens to your currency. People all over the world need it. Not because they want pounds specifically, but because it's a common currency that people from two different countries can use. And at its core, this creates one enormous advantage. You can borrow enormous amounts of money without the costs that would normally come with it. Essentially, all this new money doesn't flood your domestic economy. Instead, it gets absorbed by international demand. It's probably the most powerful advantage an empire can have.
It is, and the problem with it is all those dollars or pounds that are floating overseas, when you stop being the reserve currency, they come back. And there's probably 95%, maybe 99% even of fiscal $100 bills are outside the United States. You can imagine what happens if they all come back or start coming back.
And it's why
A little bit of inflation would be an understatement.
their governments and citizens can live beyond their means for so long. Today, the same thing happens with the United States dollar. No matter how much money the country prints, it continues to hold its position as the world's reserve currency and can avoid major inflation, at least for the most part. However, that only works as long as the rest of the world keeps wanting to hold your currency. The moment that confidence slips, the whole system
Well, there is that. There's the confidence metric. We're not talking about the Iran-Contra aspect, which is all the chaos we do behind the scenes to keep the world dollarized. We won't skip over that for now.
unravels. For Britain, that demand was driven by trade, spices, cotton, raw materials. When the empire shrank, so did the need for pounds, and the system with it collapsed. For the United States, that demand is driven by one thing: oil. And making sure that demand for dollars continues is exactly why the Gulf states have become so important to the US. Remember, just a few of these countries control almost 30% of the global supply of oil, and right now, that supply is under direct attack. The entirety of the Gulf region has effectively been transformed into an active war zone, which has forced the 6 states to massively cut back on production. Then the Strait of Hormuz, a passage which 1/5 of the world's oil passes through, was effectively shut down, with 150 ships stranded, many of which would normally carry around 2 million barrels of oil a trip. These ships are effectively sitting ducks for Iranians to target, something they haven't hesitated to take advantage of.
Boom.
Okay, so it's worth keeping in mind that oil is one of the very few commodities that literally everybody needs. It goes way beyond just powering cars. It's the fertilizer that grows food, and the plastic that packages pretty much everything that we own. The Americans, of course, knew this, and they also knew that if they could tie their currency to something that the entire world needed to buy anyways, it could effectively guarantee an endless demand for dollars. So in the years following,
It is one of the pillars of keeping the dollar a reserve currency, without a doubt.
Following the 1973 oil crisis, the administration of Richard Nixon began quietly negotiating a deal with Saudi Arabia, at the time the world's most important oil producer. By 1975, the two countries had quietly struck a deal which would reshape the global economy for decades to come. At the heart of that deal was an agreement that oil would be exclusively traded in US dollars, and that changed everything. Consider a fairly typical transaction in the global oil market. Let's say South Korea wants to buy crude oil from the United Arab Emirates. Rather than simply buying it directly, they would first need to sell their own currency to buy dollars, which only then they could use to buy oil from the UAE. The currency of a country that isn't even involved in the transaction, the dollar, becomes the middleman for the entire deal. And when you start multiplying that across every country on Earth trying to buy oil from the Gulf, the scale of it is enormous. Today, the global oil industry is worth $3.7 trillion every year, about 3% of the world's GDP, and around 90% of that trade happens outside US markets, meaning trillions of dollars are constantly circulating around the world simply because countries need to buy energy, even if they have no particular interest in trading with the US directly. This has allowed the United States to import hundreds of billions of dollars of goods from around the world without ever really having to pay for it. Instead of sending back an equivalent amount of goods, the US sends fiscal assets like treasury bonds, all made from a currency it can literally print for free. But because foreign countries need dollars to buy oil, they're just about...
That is true. There's definitely a lot of pressuring and shenanigans that go on behind the scenes to keep this dollar system in, like making sure that leaders are pro-US in as many countries as possible. It is the reason that any country that aren't, our vassal countries, Iran, Russia, China, are seen as enemies. You're either on board with holding your money in treasuries and supporting our economic system, or you're our enemy.
Happy to let the US get away with it. In fact, the United States has run a trade deficit every single year since 1976, meaning for 50 years straight, it has taken more from the world than it has given back. In 2025 alone, that deficit came to nearly $900 billion. Add all of these deficits up, and the US has accumulated roughly 26...
And this graph here shows you just how bad the situation is once we lose that reserve status, which will happen within our lifetimes. I'd say within the next probably 10 years. That's my timetable. You'll get bad inflation within the next 5 years, and then really bad inflation the 5 years after that. And at some point, once we lose the reserve status, this is going to have to balance again. And let's say prices are going to go up so much in the United States that people won't be able to buy as much, and this will balance. That is what's going to happen.
Then it is given back. Add all of these deficits up, and the US has accumulated roughly $26 trillion in net foreign debt. Goods and services all essentially paid for with paper. For ordinary Americans, that has effectively acted as a massive hidden subsidy, worth nearly $3,000 per person every single year. It's what has allowed the American middle class to maintain living standards that, for most of the 20th century, were the envy of the world, all whilst funding the largest military in history. However, the flip side is that it also gives the Gulf states an enormous amount of leverage. If those countries ever decided to price their oil in something else, say the Chinese yuan or gold, much of the global demand that underpins the dollar's dominance would vanish. And right now,
it would weaken demand for dollars. The problem is right now the yuan isn't publicly tradable. If you want to buy, hold your cash in yuan, there is no real good way for you as a U.S. citizen or someone outside the country to do that. You need to move to China and open a bank account to hold currency in yuan. Or be a company with some type of relationship with China. It's far, far more complicated. to hold Wang because of capital controls, because China tightly controls the value of its currency. So if that wasn't the case, oh my God, there would be so much demand for Wang, it would already be threatening the US dollar. But this will put more pressure on China to allow, let's say, make it easier to hold their currency, because it will be necessary if you trade oil in Wang for it to be more available. And that process will threaten the dollar, and it'll be a gradual process. It won't be instantaneous, the dollar losing its reserve status. But this Iran conflict definitely is sparking that process to begin.
The first time in decades, that possibility feels less theoretical than ever. Many of Trump's supposed Gulf Arab allies are already reviewing their investments in the States, just months after pledging trillions of dollars worth in investment. And the anger is barely being concealed. One Dubai billionaire publicly asked why the Gulf should bear the consequences of an escalation nobody had asked for, before quickly deleting the post.
Who is? Let me get
The consequences of an escalation.
His Excellency President Donald Trump, a direct question. Who gave you authority to drag our region into a war with Iran? And on what basis did you make this dangerous decision? Did you calculate the collateral damage before pulling the trigger? And did you consider that the first to suffer from this escalation will be the countries of the region itself? The people of this region have a right to ask this as well. Was this your decision alone, or did it come as a result of pressure from Netanyahu and his government? You have placed the countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council and the Arab countries at the heart of a danger they did not choose. Thank God we are strong and capable of defending ourselves, and we have armies and defense that protect our homeland. But the question remains, who gave you permission to turn our region into a battlefield? Understandable that they probably... I understand also that he deleted this because, let's say, the Arab states in the region, they're not happy with Iran, but they aren't happy with Trump either. They're not happy with both.
Escalation nobody had asked for, before quickly deleting the post. These are America's closest allies in the region, and right now they are furious. The only reason they had stuck to the petrodollar deal in the first place is because the US offered them something just as valuable in return: military protection. And if it wasn't already obvious, the US isn't holding up their side of the deal. For starters, none of the Gulf states wanted the war with Iran in the first place. Just days before it began, they were flying officials to Washington in a
Except the Sultan of Saudi Arabia apparently did want it, but a lot of the others didn't.
stitched attempt to prevent it, something that was clearly ignored. And since the war started, that treatment has only gotten worse. After the bombing began, reports emerged that Qatar's stockpile of Patriot interceptor missiles could last as little as 4 days, yet America refused to help restock them. And this also isn't the first.
I think they ended up getting Greece to turn over some Patriot missiles to extend their stockpile. But that was like 2 weeks ago, so they're probably on the verge of running out again anyway.
Time, Washington has left its Gulf partners out to dry. In 2019, Iranian drones struck Saudi Arabia's oil facilities, temporarily knocking out about 5% of the world's oil supply. But despite Saudi requests, America didn't do anything. Now, if this were any other country, then the Gulf states would have likely abandoned their side of the deal long ago. But doing that with the United States is far more difficult. Right now, global oil markets are entirely built around dollars, and that's the way they've been for nearly half a century. So,
Even if they wanted to ditch dollar, it's not that easy. Especially because, like I said, the won is hard to trade compared to the dollar. It's easy to open an account in dollars. It's not easy to open an account in won.
if a Gulf state tomorrow announced it was switching to a different currency, buyers around the world would face real costs adapting to that change. That would then force sellers to accept slightly lower prices to compensate buyers for that very inconvenience. So, even if a lot of individual countries are fed up with the US, nobody wants to be the first one to make the move. That is, as long as there isn't a very solid alternative. At the end of the day, the Gulf states don't just need a currency, they need a guarantor. Somebody who can protect their assets in one of the most dangerous and unstable regions in the entire world.
And China, unlike the United States, controls rare earths, and they can pump out huge amounts of air defense missiles, interceptors, their versions of it, if they so choose. And so if one of these countries decide to make China their patron, they could get a much stronger air defense It's that our manufacturing capability in terms of military equipment is, first of all, our manufacturing base has been outsourced to China basically, and they control rare earths. Yeah, we just can't keep up with the demand for interceptor missiles, especially with all these wars going on. But China can.
For half a century, it was America who was able to do that. But today, that isn't really the case. Over the last 2 decades, China's share of world trade has increased by around 7 times.
Yeah, that's what I wrote about on my blog 15 years ago. It really annoyed me when I realized what was going on. We outsourced our prosperity to China. Manufacturing is the backbone, the backbone of a country, the productive sector, and we outsourced it to China, and we replaced it with, just endless borrowing that's dependent on being the reserve currency. When we stop being the reserve currency, then we need to fall back on what's left of our manufacturing sector, and that's going to be really, really harsh time for us.
And today they make up about 14% of all the goods exported each year. Add to that the fact that their military and navy are now the largest in the world by personnel. It's not super surprising that the Gulf states have quietly started to pivot. China is already Saudi Arabia's largest.
The only reason our military is bigger than China's is legacy. Like I said, all these aircraft carriers, for example, we built decades ago, which when at one point in time, we were the manufacturing powerhouse of the world. After World War II, 2/3 of the world's manufacturing goods were done by us. That's why we produced all these different aircraft carriers and whatnot, all this military equipment and everything. It was produced back when we still had manufacturing. Since then, it's slowed more and more, and it's just been maintaining and with less and less new ships and aircrafts being added. But China's the opposite. They don't have any legacy. Everything they have is new because they're building up their military, but they haven't built up enough, as much as we have yet. But this Iran war, it's wearing down our military really fast. We're expanding all our stockpiles of stuff. And so I think after this, it'll be a close call who would be the greater power, military power, US or China. Well, it also depends on how long the conflict lasts. If it's on the longer side, yes, I think that might be the turning point where people start regarding China as the biggest military power.
Trading partner. And the two countries have signed a currency swap agreement that allows trade to be settled between them in yuan and reals, cutting the dollar out entirely.
Because if this drags on, it'll make everyone around the world realize the importance of the manufacturing base sustaining the military. And in China's case, they, just like Russia to a lesser extent, they have the manufacturing capability to produce all interceptor missiles they need. Whereas the United States, we just can't, because we're dependent on rare earths, and our manufacturing has been bases shrunk to the point it's paltry.
And unlike America, China doesn't lecture them about human rights, doesn't drag them into a war on their doorstep, and is willing to sell them advanced military technology without conditions attached. Again, none of this is going to break the system on its own, but each one chips away at the assumption that dollars are the only game in town. Going back to the original petrodollar deal that was struck in the 70s, the arrangement was just that Saudi Arabia would price its oil exclusively in dollars, and in return, the United States would provide security guarantees and military support. But given that, there was obviously a pretty big question as to what the Gulf states would do with all the dollars they'd acquired from selling oil. At the time, nobody really knew what this was, and it wasn't until 2016 that this was finally revealed. The secret? It was invested straight back into US financial assets, meaning money from around the world that was being used.
Of course it was. That was the whole point of us putting in these puppets there, these vassal states, is they sell their dollar in oil and then they put all their money back into the United States. And I don't think we will allow them to move those assets out of the US dollar. If all the Gulf states, if all our puppets tried to move their dollars out of their money out of the dollar, it would crash the dollar because they have so much. So we would never allow that to happen. We would put in capital control specifically for them.
Used to buy oil ended up flowing straight back into the United States economy. and the scale of this recycling was enormous. By 1977, Saudi Arabia alone held 20% of all US debt owned by foreign governments. When the figures were finally disclosed in 2016, official Saudi holdings stood at around $117 billion.
And part of this agreement where we prop them up is an understanding that they will never sell these treasuries. I guarantee that's behind the scenes. Nothing official, but yeah, we would not allow them to hold this much debt unless we had ways to make sure they're not going to dump it all at once on the market.
For the US, that money is essential. When Washington spends more than it earns, which it has done for almost every year in decades, it issues treasury bonds, essentially IOUs that investors buy today with a promise to be repaid later with interest. The more investors willing to buy that debt, the lower the interest rate Washington has to offer, and the fewer buyers, the higher that rate has to go to attract them. Effectively, the more people willing to lend to the US government, the cheaper it is for them to borrow money. And
And inflation plays a big role in interest rates. The more higher inflation is, the more interest investors want on their money, so they're not losing money to the rate of inflation.
decades of doing this, the US has ended up with an insane amount of debt, now worth nearly $39 trillion. Servicing that debt already costs the government
There's no realistic way to service that debt forever. I mean, when I say within 5-10 years, basically the dollar will collapse. One reason, just look at the amount of debt we have. That alone makes it clear.
over $1 trillion a year in interest payments, making it the largest single line item in the entire federal budget. To put that into perspective, it works out to roughly $3,000 per American every single year. And if demand for US savings were to dry up, say because the US was to alienate one of its key buyers, that number climbs very quickly. Just a 2 percentage point rise in the interest rate would cost roughly $700 billion a year. That would force Washington into an impossible choice. Either cut enormous parts of the federal budget, raise taxes dramatically, or borrow even more money just to pay the interest on the
Or print money.
money it is already borrowed. And this is really the route.
Oh, he doesn't mention that one. That is the other option that will happen at some point is the Federal Reserve prints money to buy U.S. Treasuries. It's happened at brief occasions in the past. Because of crises, Federal Reserve steps in and buys some treasuries to stabilize the market. But sustained buying by the Federal Reserve, large-scale money printing, that's the final end stage we will eventually reach. And that's when the dollar becomes just like the Zimbabwe dollar and goes up into we'll have $1 trillion bills.
Why the Gulf states hold so much power over the US, at least in the short term. What happens next will probably not be dramatic or immediate. The global financial system is far too large and far too deeply embedded.
Exactly. Even though there's all these huge warning signs and everything, this is something I've learned. It's slow. These slow-moving parts. This Iran war is going to drastically accelerate the dollar's decline as the world's reserve currency. But still, it's still going to be a slow process. And it's inflation, like soaring inflation, several years of that is going to be part of the equation to end the dollar's dominance as a reserve currency. And that several years of high inflation is going to be started by this Iran war. But you see, it still has a long road. I don't expect the complete collapse of the dollar in the very immediate future.
To suddenly collapse because of a single conflict. But systems like the one built around the petrodollar rarely end in a single moment. More often, they begin to erode slowly as countries gradually start hedging their bets. And in fact, that process has already started.
There were already signs of it 10 years, 15 years ago.
Saudi Arabia's public investment fund has been shifting billions into Asian markets. Gulf sovereign wealth funds, which collectively manage over $3 trillion, have been quietly diversifying away from US assets, and Saudi Arabia is deepening its defense relationship with China. None of this makes headlines in the way an oil embargo would, but this is what the slow bleed actually looks like. Not a dramatic break, but a gradual rebalancing. In a strange way, Trump's promise to put America first might actually end up doing the opposite. The reality is that every country, no matter how strong, is in some way reliant on its allies. In the short term, it might make sense to ignore them relentlessly.
Oh yeah, this is a good example regarding NATO, how Trump always rails against NATO. NATO is one of the backbones of the US dollar. It is because we sell so much military hardware to the Europe through NATO. NATO basically exists as to ensure that all of Europe is buying billions, if not trillions, of dollars of from our military-industrial complex, and that's why that's why the EU countries have so little actual military and so little actual troops, is because a lot of their military spending, it goes to buy extremely overinflated weapons whose costs are overinflated from the United States, and that is NATO. That is, if you took away U.S. military sales from abroad, our trade deficit gets so much worse. So much of our trade deficit is financed by these military sales to our EU vassal states, or to our Gulf vassal states, or to all those states that we dominate. And if NATO collapses, it's already, there was indication of this happening, of they already changing the way they decide where to spend their military budgets, and we get less of that share of the money EU spends on defense. That will be another thing undermining the dollar.
Pursuing your own objectives, but isolating your allies in this way inevitably comes with a cost, and in the case of the US, that might mean the end of the dollar system as we know it. Now, with Trump's announcement that the military budget of the United States will actually be $1.5 trillion next year, the largest in its history, and
that was before the Iran war.
With President Trump announcing electricity demand needs to triple, at the very least by 2030 to meet AI build-up, billionaire Robert Friedland has said that the world is sleeping into a copper crisis, and that if somebody's pointing a gun at you, you need that copper to shoot back. Copper demand is beyond belief. Supply is vanishing, and a copper shortage is just a matter of time now. President Trump has taken massive action to bring back copper production to US soil, including an
Is this an ad? Is this segment segueing into an ad?
executive order and enacting a 50% tariff on imports. In fact, Stanley Druckenmiller, who many consider to be one of the all-time greatest macro investors, a self-made billionaire with a track record of never having a losing year, is very bullish on copper. Look at the global production outlook. Right when demand is projected to soar by...
I agree that copper... well, AI is a bubble, and when that crashes, that will lower copper demand. So keep that in mind. But it is a commodity, and it is going to do well as there are shortages, as the dollar falls and whatever. So actually, I have no real advice regarding copper. I haven't studied that market, so I'll just say that it could go up, it could go down. And speaking of markets, let's watch this quickly.
Soil, include
the
15th of March.
Let's jump to this story from the Kobasi letter. This is where it gets crazy, ladies and gentlemen. Check this out. At 6:50 a.m. today, $1.5 billion in notional value worth of the S&P 500 futures contracts were bought. This trade was so large, it sent the entire index up 0.3% higher that minute.
I've been watching this happen for 15 years. Since I started, back when I was blogging about the financial markets. U.S. short sell ban. I have some graphs from way back then, but they banned short sell right before option expiration. They have been doing stuff that manipulates the market. So much I watched back then. So this is nothing new. This has been going on for the last 15 years. It's just people are noticing it now.
Then 14 minutes later, Trump announced productive discussions with Iran were underway. By 7:10 a.m., the S&P had added $2 trillion in market cap. Take a look at this.
So someone buys a huge amount of futures right here, and it's enough to move the market. Then this happens. Yes, but of course it's insider trading. But I've said several times that the entire U.S. financial system is basically a bucket shop, a Ponzi scheme at this point. That has lost connection to the underlying assets, whether it's stocks or commodities. And just like a bucket shop, when bucket shops used to be, you go in, you just say, I want to buy X amount of stock, you hand the dollars, they take the dollars, they throw it in the bucket. In this case of U.S. financial system, the bucket is U.S. Treasuries. Whatever you go to buy on the markets, whether it's commodities or a stock or whatever, 90% chance your money ends up in U.S. Treasuries. And the way that works, because what if your money goes up? Your stock that you supposedly bought goes up and you want to take it out. How does the financial system pay? Well, market manipulation is how they stay in business. The amount of money they make from swings like this, the banking sector as a whole, through selling these derivatives and money they make, that's how they can keep operating. And like when you sell the stocks you supposedly own, how they could pay you out is because they being the amount of money they made through insider trading. That's how bucket shops operate, through market manipulation. And that's how our entire financial system basically works now.
Jump right there looks like insider trading. But the question is it really insider trading if you know the president's going to make an announcement? Is that insider trading? I don't know. But whoever made those purchases, boy, did they just get rich.
Wow.
But wait, there.
So, yeah, I'm sure there is legitimate individuals getting rich, but I'm absolutely positive a big part of this insider trading is just financial institutions. Like, they probably had losses when oil prices decide to spike. And so Trump does stuff like this, and they can insider trade and make some profits and fill holes in their balance sheet through that insider trading. That is a lot less costly for Trump than like an FDIC bailout. FDIC bailouts are expensive, like when a bank goes under. So letting them do a little bit of insider trading instead of that, it's just ordinary investors that get screwed.
There's more. Let me pull this one in first. Kobasi letter says traders placed $580 million worth of oil trades 15 minutes prior to Trump's post about a potential peace deal with Iran. 6,200 Brent and WTI futures contracts were traded between 6:49.
And that's why, all the way back to 15 years ago, all this type of obvious insider trading is investigated, is because it's approved of by the government. It's government-sponsored insider trading. And, yep, to keep the financial system from going under.
And 650. 1.5 billion in notional value that we saw. It is not known whether one entity or several.
Because there's big problems in the private shadow banking system. That would be huge news if it were not for the Iran war, is the problems there. And banks have exposure to that. And so their balance sheets are being damaged in that regard. And again, it's a lot easier to allow a little bit of market manipulation than it is to do a bank bailout.
Several entities were behind those trades. These trades likely generated over $100 million worth of profit in around 20 minutes. And then he says, this is unprecedented. Short positions in Brent crude oil futures by producers, merchants, processors, and commercial users are up to a record 139 billion. These are the companies that physically produce, refine, trade, and consume oil. Short positions have doubled since the start of the year. By comparison, the 2022 energy crisis peak was around 155 billion. By selling futures contracts at today's prices, producers are agreeing to sell their future oil at around $100 per barrel, even if the market price falls by the time they actually pump it. This guarantees their revenue regardless of where prices go next, protecting their margins when prices normalize. Oil producers are seeing unprecedented profitability. Long story.
Yeah, except if the Strait of Hormuz remains closed for 6 months, all these oil futures at $100 a barrel are going to be like, if it's the oil's trading at 150 and they've promised to sell at 100, you see the issue.
Very short, ladies and gentlemen. People somewhere know exactly what the long-term play on all of this will be, and they are getting rich off it. Now, the shorts on oil are interesting because
not only the long-term plays, it's the short-term plays. This is an absolute really, really short-term play. The person that bought all this probably just sold it right up here, and they just made a fortune. This is, when I say market manipulation, I mean this type of really short-term market manipulation.
Short is a bet that a stock will fall. So if they're shorting now, they are suspecting oil will drop down. I will add additionally that rumors circulate.
No. I'm going to say I have a different interpretation of this because I've seen this happen before. It happened in 2009 when there was huge crop events. Huge amount of U.S. crop was destroyed. And the price of wheat, corn, everything was headed up. Suddenly, they started selling huge quantities of futures, future contracts, to keep the price of corn down. That's because big prime dealers like J.P. Morgan are market makers in derivatives. They buy and sell and everything. And that's a nice steady bit of income during normal times. But if you have a sudden drastic shift in, say, oil prices from 60 to like 150, they take catastrophic losses, absolutely catastrophic losses if an unpredictable, huge black swan event like that happens. And that brings down the U.S. Bankrupts some of the biggest U.S. banks in America. And the government of Trump can't allow that to happen. So they have to hold the price of oil down under 100 or at least 110, as low as they can, while those banks reposition themselves in derivative markets for higher prices. And to hold down the price, yes, you have to release oil from strategic reserves, but the other way to do that is to sell a huge amount of futures. That manipulates the market prices lower. And then it gives banks time to reposition themselves in long-term derivatives related to oil.
In D.C. have been the entire time that this will not last, this conflict, more than a few weeks. So we're already at a few weeks when Trump announces this.
Because even if they're selling at 100 oil futures at $100 a barrel, knowing that oil is going to go up to 150, it's still worth it if it keeps oil prices down for now and stop trillions of dollars of derivatives from being in the money and banks having to pay those up. If they can prevent that, it's if the losses on all these oil futures that they've just sold is still worth it.
Rumors are that it's going to be over relatively shortly. And it could just be, I've heard those same rumors too. So somebody went in and bought a bunch of stocks, hearing rumors in D.C. Or it could be these rumors are born. Well, it could also be that because of these purchases, people spread rumors. I think loose lips are happening in D.C. Somebody in the Trump administration.
No, it's well, yes, that could also be happening. But I think that this Iran war is hurting the financial system. And Trump is being told privately that banks are on the verge of going under if oil prices keep going up or whatever. And so he's been giving warnings, dire warnings about the possibility of the financial system crashing, and they're using that to manipulate him. And they're insider trading that how they're manipulating him. And that is keeping the financial system going. Well, eventually one day learn all of this, but it won't be. It'll be after everything crashes.
Why would they negotiate? What is the point? 3 weeks? Of course they will be able to control the Hormuz for the next 3 weeks or maybe longer. The damage will have already been done by then in our supply lines, in Western supply lines.
There's no way we can open the Strait of Hormuz militarily in a time frame that could save the global economy, because the amount of time it takes to mobilize over 100,000 troops and get them in, 6 months will already have passed.
In Western commodities, many things won't be able to be produced without helium. Many things won't be able to be extracted without sulfuric acid. This is going to change dramatically the color and the idea. We're going back to what it was, just to be clear, before the 70s, when America changed the whole formula. But before that, Iran was a major power in the region, a major regional power. a major civilization, a major Islamic power in it. And in the 70s, effectively, the United States decided that it wanted to make the emirs and the monarchs, the Sunni emirs and monarchs of the region, their proxies and put them in opposition to Iran. And of course, together with Israel, Israel has also used this to contain, weaken, and undermine Iran. And now Iran, which has been planning this since 2003, is unfolding their plan for a return.
And it's going really well so far.
Of Persia to prominence in the region after all these years since the revolution and since Dick Cheney if you like, it was Dick Cheney in 2006 after the war in Lebanon. And he was complaining bitterly then. Cheney said, well, look, what's happened? Now the war in Lebanon, this was the war between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. They seem to have won it. And we thought Iraq war was going to weaken Iran. And we thought this was going to weaken Iran. And he had with him in this meeting, Prince Bandar, who was then the head of Saudi intelligence. And Bandar said, listen, we can sort this out. The king says, and the king knows, he says, the weakest point for Iran is Syria. We can cut Syria. And
that's what they did with ISIS. And ISIS genocided 1 million Christians in Syria. And so, I will add that I didn't know this angle to it, that Saudi played a big role. But yes, Saudi, that brand of radical Islam, yes, they funded all across the Middle East. Not surprising. They played a role in that. So I'll add Mossad, CIA, and Saudi Arabia to those responsible for the genocide of Christians in Syria.
Apart from actually...
And I hold grudges about that. I think it's the worst thing that's happened in the Middle East in the past 30 years or more.
A collapse in Iran, cutting off Syria and its lifeline to Hezbollah is the next best thing we can do. And Cheney initially said, oh, no, that's, how would you do this? It's too difficult. And Bandar said, Islamists will do
ISIS.
This. Islamists. We can do that. And don't worry, you don't have to be involved. And now...
the United States was involved. There's articles about that. Yes, they were definitely involved. Mossad was involved too. They admit as much. I'm not going to go through the articles now, but I covered them in a different video.
It was an attempt to try and create, if you like, a Sunni primacy across the whole region in antagonism and in hostility to Iran, the former power that had been very much an influence in the region until that point. And so now we are seeing the move to shift it back to what it was. Iran emerging as a dominant power, and if you like, the states, the monarchs, the emirs of the region, of the GCC, taking a subordinate place in the new paradigm.
So now we have to see, where do we go from here? Because you kind of alluded to this at the beginning. That may be the Iranian plan. They may want to return that. They may have had this for decades of an idea, and now then perversely only because...
They have been preparing for it decades. You don't build those huge missile silos and mountains without decades of preparation.
President Trump opened the door with this war of choice to actually allow them to put it into operation. Now it is going in there. I just put in their IRGC spokesman said basically they're implementing it now, that only we will determine who goes through the Gulf. But that implies that they can. Now there is a lot of traffic rolling around. I've got some sources from a couple of different places that imply that we may be about to do something on the ground to try and...
We will, because Trump is desperate, and that's... He knows that he's finished if he does nothing, so why not try something?
Shake this up to take away the Iranian capability. The missiles apparently are going to continue to rain. So the question is, if we go in on the ground somewhere, in addition to what we've been doing in the air, is that going to compel Iran and force them to open up the strait on our terms, not on theirs?
Spoiler, no.
Oh, I think it's likely to be a catastrophe for the United States. I mean, the geography of Hormuz is...
And drones. We're in the era of drones warfare, and we know Russia has provided fiber optic drones to Iran. And those are just deadly.
Most unforgiving. I mean, this has been something that has been fought over 1500s. The Portuguese established forts all along the Hormuz to control it at that time. And then eventually it was taken away from the Portuguese and ended up with the British for a while. But the Hormuz is terrible terrain. All along first of all, the length of the Hormuz, the border, the area of Iran extends for 2,000 kilometers. That's the extent of the, if you like,
Yes, it's a huge coastline.
they're facing onto the Hormuz waterway. And it's
Yeah, all of this needs to be taken to open Strait of Hormuz.
cliffs. It's those,
And the mountains behind,
it's mountains behind
and the islands.
and cliffs at the front. So all along those cliffs, it's honeycombed with anti-ship missiles. In the mountains, you get fire control. Hormuz, if you look at the actual peninsula, if you go back to the peninsula,
It's like a huge fortress, land fortress, right, along the sea. It's, I'd say 200,000 troops minimum to conquer all this, and at least 6 months after you get the 200 troops there.
and it's cliffs. In the mountains, you get fire control. Hormuz, if you look at the actual peninsula, if you go back to the peninsula, you can see that anyone trying to go there, because they have, Iran has 270-degree fire control
From here to here, yes, every direction they can shoot you. Yeah.
missiles or anything, but simply from the mountains behind. That's where their artillery is. It's close enough to control it by artillery. But of course, they have many other things. They have high-speed submersible drones.
They do.
They have speedboat,
They've used those already.
surface drones. They have manned drones. And they have something else, which has not been put into the consideration, is they have about 25 or so mini submarines. And the mini submarines, unlike bigger submarines, these mini submarines can actually operate inside Hormuz. It's not a deep, if you like, seaway, but the mini submarines can operate in it. So where are these troops going to stage? How are they're going to be supplied?
Great
How are they
question.
going to get there? I mean, I see people talking. I heard, Hexeth and talking about helicopters, Apache helicopters, and Osprey aircraft. I mean, for goodness sake, that part of Iran is watched with, a man-pads would bring down an Osprey or an Apache aircraft. I know I was sort of responsible in Afghanistan, and we brought down Russian helicopters and other things were brought down by man-pads then. It's very easy terrain for Iran to defend because they have bare, rugged mountains behind cliffs. I mean, there's no land. I think there are about 3 little beaches along that area. And 2,000 kilometers, 2,500 Marines coming in and 1 Marine Expeditionary Unit. That means 1 man per kilometer. I mean, and then the 82 Brigade comes in. It's the light infantry. They don't have heavy armor. They don't have heavy weapons. They just have the food that they carry with them. How long does that last? And where are you going to resupply it from? And what is...
Yes, basically, anything, ground operation isn't likely to be successful.
going to be the consequence? And what is Iran going to do in response? Iran has made it clear, if there is an attempt to take the islands in Hormuz or to take Karg Island, they then will attack the remaining elements of infrastructure in the Gulf states.
Oil infrastructure in the Gulf will get pounded. It'll take years to recover.
Infrastructure, especially those that have declared war on Iran, as UAE has just done so.
Yeah, UAE, that is greed talking, because the United States promised them to turn over any island they've captured, probably. And they're going to regret it.
It's their ambassador, Taiber in Washington, has written a statement saying that the UAE now has joined with the United States in a war on Iran. So it's a belligerent in it. And I don't think that people are looking at the wider landscape of what's happening. You can't just look at it in terms of Hormuz and nothing else. Look further. Look what's happened in Iraq. After the United States bombed some of the official army of Iraq, the Prime Minister, Sudari, gave the militia, the PMU, the Hashad al-Sha'abi, permission to join the war with Iran against the United States and against Israel. And they are mobilizing. They have been mobilizing in Erbil. They've been attacking the Kurdish forces in Erbil and the American bases in Erbil. And they have been attacking that, heavily driving the Kurds, if you like, into a trap. with the Iranian forces on the other side of the border, and they are also massing on the border of Kuwait. They are.
I mentioned this earlier. The Iraqi militias have entered this war too.
Enraged by the attack on the supreme leader. Iraq is a majority Shia country, and many of the Ayatollahs in Iraq have declared mandatory defensive jihad against the United States and against Israel. And so the Iraqis are actually mobilizing, and they're advancing, and they are mobilizing at the border of Kuwait, and they are mobilizing at the borders of Syria elsewhere. And they're ready to join this war if America decides to escalate it further, or if UAE escalates it further. Then you will find, I think, that the whole topography of the war
You can see there's still a lot of escalation to be had in the Middle East.
is then spreading. Turkey will then undoubtedly have a say in this, certainly in Syria. It will want to place its forces there in Syria, and we will see. Already, we have in Hezbollah massive attacks taking place against Israel. I don't know if you've been following it, but they're losing their Merkava tanks. I mean, in one day, 21 tanks destroyed by Hezbollah.
Let's stop the video and have a look at that.
In the footage from Deir Syrian in southern Lebanon, a Hezbollah fighter launches a guided anti-tank missile at an Israeli Merkava tank advancing during the ground operation. The missile streaks toward the target as the tank moves along the road near the pond area. A mid-air explosion occurs, consistent with partial interception by the tank's trophy active protection system. Despite this, the main warhead strikes the Merkava, causing a large fireball and thick smoke to engulf the vehicle. In the footage from...
Yep.
The video...
These types of videos will appear about U.S. troops as soon as they land on the ground.
Video shows Hezbollah fighters in southern Lebanon using a precision-guided anti-tank missile system to target an Israeli Merkava tank. The missile follows a clear trajectory before impact, highlighting Hezbollah's continued use of advanced munitions to challenge Israeli armor in the ongoing border conflict. The video shows Hezbollah fighters...
One last one.
Hezbollah released footage showing a guided anti-tank missile striking the rear of an Israeli Merkava tank in southern Lebanon. The projectile slammed into the ammunition storage area, triggering a bright explosion, and thick smoke erupted inside the compartment. However, the crew managed to move the damaged vehicle away from the ambush site as flames continued burning from its rear compartment. Hezbollah...
Well, that tank is still damaged, too damaged to be used anymore.
21 tanks, and of course the crews too. I mean, some crew got out, I believe, and then the day before it was 8 tanks. I mean, they are suffering enormously. Hezbollah is attacking the whole of northern Israel. The settlers are very unhappy and they want to leave and to abandon the townships
Not hearing much about all of this in the media, are you?
On the north and in Israel itself. We have Naftali Bennett, who's likely to be possibly the next prime minister, in saying, we've lost the war. We're losing this war. We have lost it in Iran. We are not achieving any of our objectives in Iran. We've lost it with Hamas and we've lost it with Hezbollah. We are losing the wars. And he was very clear because then the chief of defense staff called an emergency. It's in the Hebrew papers today. And he said, listen, I'm putting up 10 red flags. We don't have the troops for this. We're so short of troops. We can't do a war, all these wars at the same time, and what we see. And in fact, it was also put out by RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute in London, says, Israel has run out of missiles. It's self-defense missiles, it's standoff missiles.
Yeah, here's the article. It's, of course, trying to fight 3 wars at the same time, Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran, as well as getting pounded by Iranian missiles, as well as the length of time the conflicts have gone on. Of course, Israel army is exhausted.
Missiles. In 16 days, it has run out of these missiles, and so has America. And America has had to remove its one carrier. The other carrier is now far off the shore. So we have to take the big picture of the war as well into account when we talk about troops landing in Iraq, in Iran, in the Hormuz. What would that mean? It would mean the war widens, becomes a regional war, perhaps even somewhat of a sectarian war. And so America would be in the middle of this. And it won't find a friendly staging point in Iraq. In fact, I think Iraq is intending to occupy Kuwait, and Iran.
Remember, we attacked Iraq once because they invaded Kuwait. What will we do this time?
If there is an attack and UAE is a part of it, may decide to invade the UAE. We're talking about something very different. So that's why I made these rather sort of terse comments about the cabinet meeting, where everyone was saying, oh, it's wonderful, they're begging for, Iran is begging for a negotiation. They are failing. We've defeated their Air Force. By the way, what he was saying, Hegseth is just untrue. They do not have air superiority over Hormuz. Look, they just had an F-15, F-18 or whatever it was shot down.
We don't have air superiority over Iran. Or air supremacy. We do have, I think, air supremacy over like sections of Western Iran, but not the Strait of Hormuz.
Over Bandar Abbas by the Iranians have been slowly showing their hand, not all at once. And now we see that they do have air defenses and that they're quite efficient.
Let me go down that path, because that is part of the curiousness of it. And for those who may have missed it, I want to show a bit of what Secretary Hegseth said in that meeting. But I'm going to kind of set it up by looking here. This is in the New York Times. You were talking about the Israeli admissions that was leaked, that apparently that their conflict, that they can't even continue to fight with the troops they have. And this is the precedence here, is that we are already suffering, and 13 of our military bases in the region are all but uninhabitable. So that's the entry point. We have had both an F-35 and an F-18.
Probably all the buildings have been struck by drones or missiles, and so you have buildings with no roofs. I think that's what they mean about uninhabitable.
Shot down here recently when they have attempted to penetrate. Lots of MQ-9s, the drones that we have for reconnaissance also have been shot down, at least 11 of them. And yet, with all of that, here's what Pete Hegseth is boasting about yesterday.
A-10 Warthogs, if you know them, you love them, and Apache helicopter gunships are flying strike missions inside Iranian airspace and throughout the Strait of Hormuz at will. See, you only send these slow, low-flying, close air support platforms.
What the hell is he saying?
When the enemy has no meaningful air defenses left. Their presence is proof that Iran's air
Then how did they shoot down another one of our jets yesterday?
defenses are gone. Their command and control is shattered, their top leaders hiding in underground bunkers, while their mid-level commanders are being crushed in the field. The morale of their fighters plummeting. We see that disconnect daily.
So talk about a disconnect daily. What he described there and what you described so beautifully in the foregoing section here are literally incompatible. They can't be talking about the same place. And yet this is the guy that's going to be in charge with the orders, instructions of the guy sitting next to him to potentially launch a ground operation to take care of to force the hand here. How do you see that unfolded?
Well, it's a catastrophe. That's why I said a catastrophe, because there doesn't seem to be any real understanding. At that level, at the level, of course there is in other parts of the Pentagon, but there is not an understanding at the level that there should be.
It's all bluster and propaganda coming out from Trump and his Secretary of War.
What they're facing. To claim that they've got air superiority, air dominance, is just untrue. There is only some areas of it, of, if you like, penetration. But all of the attacks on Iran, all of the attacks, vast amount of attacks, are by standoff weapons, standoff cruise missiles, JASSM missiles. And
standoff cruise missiles.
America's running out of those too, by the way. They now, I think, RUSI, RUSI say that perhaps it can last for another 10 days, but then they'll be exhausted. So they haven't got even those. So to suggest you can fly the Osprey, which is a very vulnerable aircraft, into hostile territory. The Iranian...
When they say standoff missiles, that means fighters will fly to the edge of Iran and then shoot these standoff missiles, and the missiles will travel like 200, 300, 400 miles and then hit their targets. That way the plane can turn around and avoid going deep into Iranian airspace and avoid danger. That's how we are doing most of our bombing. By the way, air superiority, I think somewhat we've established air superiority over on this side, but over here we do not have air superiority.
Army, just to remind ourselves, I know you're aware of it, but this is not just a sort of little irregular group. It's a 1 million-man army, and that's not the militia. The Basij is also another 1 million. These are big forces to take on, and to take that on.
2 million troops, basically.
By 2,500 Marines. I think is asking for trouble. It should be a real concern to people in the leadership. But the way that cabinet meeting was being held and the discussions and, and Witkoff coming in and saying, well, look, I mean, what we have to say to the Iranians, if they don't take this opportunity, woe betide them. This is the last chance you've got. You've got to sit down and sign up to the 15 points. 15 points.
And that jet later went down.
They're not interested in those 15 points. They've done with all of this. Now we are in the decisive war for Iran. This is their existential war, and they're going to prolong it as far as necessary to meet their objectives. And of course, part of this will be that they expect that the Hormuz will be a major source of income for them.
Yes, that's one of their demands, is permanent control of Strait of Hormuz. Like Egypt takes tolls for anyone going for the Suez Canal. They want to keep control of Strait of Hormuz and impose tolls permanently going forwards to ships. You can see that's one of their demands. You can see how far we are from an agreed diplomatic solution based on that. Trump on one side asking for complete surrender, and Iran asking for reparations, for complete exit of U.S. troops from the region, and for control over Strait of Hormuz. It's, it's not going to end soon. Anyhow, this will be on YouTube. Please like and subscribe, and come watch on Kick or Twitch. And I'll see you in the next video. Bye.